It's been now since 2001 since the WWE has gone through Raw GMs. There was the 50-50 deal with Vince and Ric Flair in 2001, 2002. But Ric Flair wasn't really the GM of well, he was kind of the GM of Raw, but not so much. Vince McMahon started off in 2002. I think it was in June of no, it was July of 2002. Vince McMahon hired a new GM of Raw, which was Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff was the very first Raw GM. Eric Bischoff was probably one of the best GMs they had. He was there the longest as well. Until in 2000 the end of 2005, I think, they fired him and they hired a new GM, which was Jonathan Coachman. Jonathan Coachman, he was the GM after Eric Bischoff. The coach wasn't a bad GM at all as well. Eric Bischoff was better, but Jonathan Coachman wasn't bad at all. Jonathan Coachman was the executive of Eric Bischoff. Um, but I forget what happened to him. I don't know if he went to ESPN to do Sports Center, and then Michael Adamle, he was the next Raw GM. From he was a GM for only a couple of months. He wasn't really there that long. Basically, the story with him getting fired was Stephanie McMahon always told him to change his plans, and there was an incident on Raw where Randy Orton says either you fire Kevin Adamle or I'm quitting. Kevin Adamle resigned himself and then had an argument with Stephanie McMahon about how he always changed things, basically. And then he left. Then William Regal, he was the next Raw GM, and he was the commissioner of the WWE in 2001. He had experience with this before, but what happened with him was his last match was as the general manager was with Mr. Kennedy, and Vince McMahon said if William Regal loses, he gets fired. And Mr. Kennedy beat him in a match on Raw, and then William Regal got done. He got fired. Although he still wrestled, he just wasn't, the GM anymore. They hired him back as something, which then led to the anonymous GM, probably the biggest piece of crap on Raw in a while. I hated the anonymous GM of Raw. Later on, they said the story of it was Hornswoggle. That was before this happened. Like, the anonymous GM was the most ridiculous storyline probably in Raw history. Like, we never knew who the GM was. They always played it off like maybe it's Stone Cold, maybe it's The Rock, who knows. But the anonymous GM was basically the biggest bunch of bullshit on Raw, and it made Raw look really, really bad. Then Vince McMahon hired John Laurinaitis. John Laurinaitis, he was okay as a GM. They didn't give him. I don't think they gave him enough time. He was a GM of Raw. Then he won a match. Team Johnny won a match at WrestleMania against Team Teddy, and he became the GM of both Raw and SmackDown. I think he could have done better. They just didn't give him enough time. You know, he had the kind of Vince McMahon kind of heel gimmick. It would be him versus John Cena in the main event. Then have a cage match. It was going to be John Cena versus the Big Show in a cage match. He did some things that were actually okay. He just didn't speak very well, and his people power thing didn't last so long. Some people complained that they didn't give him enough time, but I think he was okay, and I do agree they should give him enough time, but he wasn't the best GM. He got fired because John Cena beat the Big Show in a cage match, and Vince McMahon fired him. And then there's AJ. Huh. Not a very good choice for a GM. Maybe one of the worst. She got fired because Vicky Guerrero had some dirt on her in a meeting, I guess, about her and John Cena having an affair, and that's why they got rid of her. But the main point is Raw having trouble finding a decent GM to stay around? Out of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, out of 7 or 8 GMs, Eric Bischoff was probably the best GM they had. He lasted the longest and made things interesting. Jonathan Coachman was pretty good, and John Laurinaitis. They were all okay. But basically, what I'm saying is, I'm thinking that in the WWE, they're having a hard time finding a reliable GM. That's making it hard, like who can they keep around for a while? I actually thought about bringing Ric Flair back in a storyline from a Scoop website, but I just think they're having trouble finding a GM to stick around, in my opinion. I don't know. They just need to work on